ואני מזמין את מיכל רובין להציג את הדובר הבא.
I'd like to start by reminding all our friends who are on the stairs that there are seats here in the middle and you're more than welcome to come find one. כל החברים שלנו שיושבים פה על המדרגות, בבקשה, יש פה מקומות ישיבה באמצע האולם. אתם מוזמנים לבוא לשבת. I'd also like to remind everyone that our next lecture is in English. For those of you who haven't had the chance to get your simultaneous translation headphones and who would like them, they're located right outside the hall. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our guest lecturer and close friend of the Taub Center, Professor Stephen Popper. Professor Popper is a senior economist at Rand Corporation and a professor at the Pardee Rand Graduate School. In the past, Professor Popper served as the Associate Director of the Rand Science and Technology Policy Institute, where he provided research and analytic support to the White House Office of Science and Technology Policies and other agencies of the executive branch. His current work focuses on socioeconomic long-term strategy, energy, decision-making under uncertainty, and technology policy. He has served as a consultant to the World Bank and OECD, and is currently a fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute in Jerusalem. Professor Popper received his PhD in economics from the University of California at Berkeley. His participation in today's conference is part of the Taub Center's ongoing and expanding partnership with the Rand Corporation. Our joint commitment to objective, evidence-based research at the highest professional level creates very fertile ground for productive cooperation between the Taub Center and Rand. We have seen this budding partnership flourish on both sides of the ocean, and we're looking forward to continuing it and to strengthening this collaboration in the future. Professor Popper, Stephen, our friend, the stage is yours.
תודה רבה, תודה למרכז טאוב וגם למשפחת סינגר. אני מצטער שאני צריך לדבר באנגלית, אבל באמת אני מדבר בעברית לא כל כך טוב. And indeed, it's a pleasure for me to be here to support in some small way the work that is being done by the Taub Center. You can see by my tie that I am the token non-Israeli here. I'm not wearing it for your sake, I'm wearing it for mine. I would not be able to take myself seriously if I was not wearing it. Let's see. I was asked to provide an international perspective, and what I'm going to do in about 30 minutes is discuss three things. One is basically the role of strategy in public policy, and particularly government. I spend a lot more time than is healthy for my career as an economist thinking about how governments are effective, how government can be effective in action. And indeed, I've done a fair amount of work with a series of governments around the world. The second thing that I will talk about briefly is what's the international experience with deliberate attempts to think strategically, to think about public policy from a strategic perspective. And then, for what it's worth, I will offer a few thoughts about strategy in Israel's domestic public policy. Now, no one this morning has bothered to define what strategy is. What does the term mean? Much less to distinguish between strategy, a specific strategy, strategic planning, plans, and so on and so forth. And this is something that I am not going to discuss either. There are as many definitions of strategy as there are people writing on the subject, because what I really want to do is talk about something a little more nebulous, a little different. I want to talk about a strategic perspective that we would bring to discussions of public policy. If you are familiar with some of the work by Yechezkel Dror of the Hebrew University, you know that he speaks about changing the culture, the thinking of leaders, and also of the led, how the public actually responds to discussions of public policy. Or to put it a different way, during the course of my talk, think about that very elegant single slide that Professor Dahan showed us. And then the question is, how do you make that typical? How do you make that customary? How do you get to the point where the government of Israel, where the public policy organs of Israel actually think along those lines? And I'm going to start in a very strange place, far from Israel and a long time ago. The D-Day landings in Normandy in the Second World War, the US, Canadian, and British forces going ashore. And in particular, the question is, what happened to the US 502nd Parachute Regiment? Because this was the plan. That's where they were supposed to land. This was their landing zone. What actually happened is shown by all of these blue dots spread all over the place. Each dot here represents an entire plane load of paratroops. And you will see not a single plane load was delivered according to the plan. And this is not the only thing that went wrong. You see, I don't have a pointer. I do have a pointer. You see, you have to point it in the right direction. This is where the US 4th Infantry Division landed. They were actually supposed to land up around here. Meanwhile, the US 1st Infantry Division was being massacred on Omaha Beach by German opposition that was not supposed to be there. And the British and the Canadian forces, who were supposed to reach a certain objective by the end of the day, 30 days later still had not met that objective. Now, the reason that I bring it up is I really want to set up this quotation made about a dozen years later by the commander of that operation, who then became the President of the United States. He said, plans are worthless, but planning is everything. Now, what's happening here? Was the President of the United States during the Cold War secretly a communist, a believer in planning? No, I will explain it by going somewhere else again. Daniel Kahneman and his colleagues have done work demonstrating that there really are two different systems of thought inside the human mind. One is the one that operates very quickly. It's almost automatic. You recognize a pattern, you react, it's instinctive. The second is slow thinking. It's more deliberative. It's conscious, it's deductive reasoning, it's inductive reasoning, and so on. So what Eisenhower might actually have been asking and saying is, how can we create the ability to use this slow thinking capacity in situations that force us to think quickly? Now, I've pulled a trick on you because I'm talking about research that relates to human psychology, the psychology of the individual, and I'm kind of applying it to a larger entity, to organizations, to governments, to public sectors, and I'm going to do it to you again. Another problem that arose from the military was, how do you explain the fact that fighter pilots from a particular country flying planes that are roughly similar to those that their opponents are flying, how can they consistently win the air battles? How can they consistently dominate the airspace? And they did studies and they did dissections, and what they discovered was a loop of reasoning. The first is that the pilot observes the situation, the context that he's in, and then he orients himself in terms of a larger dimension. He gathers facts and he's assessing, analyzing these facts. Then he is making a decision, and then he puts the decision into action. And this is a recursive loop. Then the next step is to continuously now observe what the new facts are, the result of the action, and so on and so forth. And what I'm going to suggest is that the strategic perspective that I'm talking about adds something to the act of government. That, you know, not just in Israel, but in many countries, you see what appears to be a loop of decision and action, without this additional component. Now, is this a metaphor? Yes, in part it is. Again, I'm taking from the individual and now starting to think about how an organization, how a government, how a polity behaves. But this is not an old problem. If you look at some of the most interesting organizations in world history, the thing that made them interesting was thinking precisely about how you get this organized hierarchic mind to function. The Jesuit order during the Renaissance period, the Prussian General Staff worked this problem intensively. And it extends to the Google Corporation of today. How do they get people to think a certain way? And it extends all the way back to the Babylonian academies, where people were constructing the Talmud. So what builds a strategic perspective? Again, I wish that I had Professor Dayan's slide here instead of mine. But basically, you need institutions and processes that will ask a series of questions explicitly. What are the issues that affect public interests? How do these issues connect to one another? What is the public purpose that could benefit from policy action? What is realistically attainable? Again, Professor Dahan's discussion of the price of a pot. You do it through appropriate selection of policies and tools. You do it through other means that you have at your disposal, both direct and indirect. You have a posture of actively observing and analyzing that's not theoretical, that's not academic, but it's actually based in these questions. And then you need to have an apparatus and a commitment to working toward the answers. This often requires framing and testing of alternative policy courses of action. Now, if there is a message to my talk, it's really contained on this slide. What I'm suggesting is that when you place emphasis on this strategic perspective, this posture, it helps you avoid certain traps that you would fall into otherwise. One of them is the trap of thinking solely in terms of strategy. Well, strategy is just a tool. You know, I've worked with governments where people say, well, we need a strategy for X, Y, or Z. I say, fine. First, you need to tell me where you're trying to go. What's the vision? What is the outcome that you would consider good? That's where you begin the strategy process. Secondly, is that strategy may be a thing. There may be a specific strategy that's selected among other strategies. There may be a strategic plan. There may be a white paper that is issued that contains the government's policy. But time after time after time, it becomes clear that what really comes out of it, what's really valuable, what Eisenhower and his planning staff discovered was all the discussion, all of the things that led up to the plan that really were valuable. Government needs to be, if you're going to be serious, you have to measure. You have to set goals, you have to figure out what you're going to measure, you have to do those measurements, otherwise you don't know where you are. And government is not omniscient. It doesn't know everything. And you certainly discover this if you are trying to have a strategic perspective, one where you are asking questions. You need to make use of external expertise, and you need to build flexible and adaptive thinking and planning. Okay, now let me talk briefly about sort of what happens in places other than Israel with strategic thinking and planning. First, let me make a point that I think is very important. I used examples that came from the military because they're very stark, and people can immediately understand them. So the question is, what is different between the strategy problem in the military and the strategy problem in the government public sector, say in the socioeconomic sphere? The answer is that the military has a much easier problem than the government has when it tries to think strategically. Why is that? Well, the obvious one. The whole job of the military is to control its environment, to control the pace of operations, to control the battle space, to control the information space, and so on. Government in a democracy does not have that luxury, and especially a particular ministry or government organ not only has to work within the larger environment, but also within the environment of the government itself. Goals of the military are relatively limited, but we judge governments basically on not only how they do on transportation, but also health and education and social welfare and so on and so forth. And then typically, military success all sort of moves in one direction, but the government needs to do a lot of balancing. What it does in promoting economic growth may come at the expense of, environmental health, for example. So as I say, I've done work for a number of governments. What I'm specifically looking at is an exercise that some RAND colleagues and I did about 2 years ago, where we did intensive case studies of 4 countries, and then also did more topical surveys of a number of other countries. So the first group was actually chosen because of size, other characteristics. They had something similar to to what one finds in Israel. And we found a number of things. One of the most important things is that this strategic perspective is what I would call, or what organizational theorists would call, a precarious value. What's a precarious value? Well, say you're in an organization, say it's a company, and you have everybody in the company focused on the bottom line. They're focused on what the production results are going to be for the next quarter or for the current fiscal year. And then you have a bunch of guys in the strategy unit who are thinking about 3 or 5 years ahead, and this seems irrelevant to the other people in the organization. In particular, it's kind of dangerous. Here, everybody is keeping their mind on the important thing, and these guys, not only are they not contributing, but they're wasting everybody's time. They're asking questions. They're having you play scenario exercises and so on. The tendency inside any organization and inside governments is to either directly or indirectly kind of kill off this strategic function. So it's not sufficient just to set up, this is going to be our strategy unit. This is going to be our Office of Strategic Analysis. Somehow, it is necessary to create conditions where there is endogenous demand, where from inside the organization, people are going to ask for the products from the strategic process. We looked at where this demand for strategic perspectives comes from, and actually it's very interesting. It differs quite a bit from country to country. In some cases there are legal requirements. In some cases it's because some very forceful leader demanded that there be this capacity. In some cases there's what you would call a culture of strategic thinking. It's very interesting. I was just recently in Vietnam, working on a project for planning in the Mekong River Delta, the first time I was ever in Vietnam, which is interesting for an American of my generation. And I became very aware that they are a culture that actually asks for analysis. The government wants scenarios, they want analysis, and so on and so forth before they act. So what you discover is that different countries have kind of different mixtures. In British Columbia, for example, the main drivers not only was the presence of a forceful premier, but also legal requirements. In Denmark, which has a tradition of consultative and consensus decision-making, it's more innate in the culture. And Singapore provides yet another example. These things generally are not required by law, but come are only given kind of a legal basis after the fact. The strategic perspective actually provides, tangible value. It enhances the ability to make short-term decisions from a strategic perspective. That is to say, to make decisions in the short term that are consistent and don't work against long-term goals. It provides a platform for discussion and deliberation. It's remarkable how infrequently, even within a single unitary organization, a company or a ministry, there are important conversations that never take place unless you provide some kind of a platform for people to discuss. And this is true within and across the government, but also in many of these countries, what you see, actually in most of them, is a very strong component of public engagement. And it helps create that shared vision that we talked about as being necessary for strategy. It then allows you to move from the theoretical academic phase to, actually moving towards implementation, creating the political mobilization that is necessary to carry out policy, and gives you the navigational tools. So in the course of implementing the policy, you can see how it's going and what needs to be changed, what needs to be adaptive. Okay. I'd like to very quickly run through some common themes that are typical of the success stories and conspicuous by their absence in those cases where the strategic thinking process failed to develop into an actual strategic perspective. The first is that, if you don't have the interest of the big guy, if you don't have the interest of the head of the government, you're in rough shape. Maybe you will be able to survive until the next government comes in, but you're not going to get much benefit or influence from strategic planning and thinking. There very often is a specific strategy unit designated as such that is attached closely to the Prime Minister's office. This is not always true. In some countries, there is something that takes this place that is not formally a strategic planning unit, but it does have a close connection to the head of the government. As I said before, there needs to be internal demand for strategic thinking. Very often what you find in the most successful cases is that there are strategy units or deputy ministers or mankalim who will have within the different ministries also their own units. Analysis and input from outside the government is universally the case in all of the instances that we looked at. It is one thing to develop longer-term strategy. It's another thing to have the capacity of doing updating and understanding where you are in relation to where you want to go. Increasingly, the use of formal analytic methods to support deliberation. The U.S. National Research Council came out in 2009 basically for outlining how a more collaborative process between decision makers and analysts can work. It was not an accident that one of my colleagues at RAND was on that panel, because this is exactly what we try to do, but we see it in the most successful cases. Publication, open publication of strategy documents, backup materials, and so on, and invariably where it's successful, strong links between strategy and budget formulation. Okay, let me turn to the last part of my talk. What perspective can I bring for thinking about this in Israel? First, let me say that what I am going to discuss are my own views. They are not necessarily those of the RAND Corporation. They are not necessarily the views of the public sector and other actors I have worked with in a professional capacity in Israel. So, Israel needs, deserves, and should have a government whose actions are effective, adaptive, robust in a region where there is so much uncertainty. But isn't that what Israel has? wait a minute, I mean, isn't flexible and adaptive what Israel already does? Hasn't Israel proceeded to where it is through a genius for gifted improvisation? No. Or put it slightly differently. Israel is no longer a country of chalutzim and small businessmen. It is increasingly becoming an important node in the global knowledge economy. It has become a very complex society, and the institutions of governance that were conceived of in an earlier era are not necessarily well suited to the challenges Israel faces. But let me be very clear. There is a quiet crisis of government institutions in Israel. There is also a similar crisis in the United States, and in the European Union, and in India, and in Japan, and in every democratic country. They are being challenged in ways that they had never been challenged before, and they need a way, they need tools, they need means to address these new challenges. Now, in the case of Israel, being adaptive and effective really does not come from short-term improvisation. You're not going to come up with a short-term improvisation to solve the list of problems that Professor Ben David talked about in his presentations. The way that you actually become flexible, adaptive, and effective is through anticipation and preparation. And again, I'm not going to huck you and cup again about the strategic perspective, but in particular, some of the issues that seem to be problematic in Israel, like bridging short-term versus long-term, and working the complex issues that cross ministerial boundaries, certainly would be affected. Again, I am going to say things that are based upon some research, not only that I and my team did, but our research partners, Sami Friedrich and his team at Shaldor, Strategic Consulting, Management, did. He and his team actually talked to, I can't remember the number, it was 40 or 50, 60 intensive interviews with people who had been involved with the government of Israel in one way or another, and basically asked a series of questions. And then we compared that with, again, what seemed to be going on in the success stories in other countries, and came up with a set of 7 gaps that, at least in the past, one could say there was some evidence, some testimony for existing in Israel. And again, I'm talking about Israel. You can very often see the same things in other countries to one degree or another. The first is that whatever strategic processes there actually are seem to be not as well connected to the actual decision makers as they could be. The second gap is a tendency for policy to be reactive. The 2011 middle-class revolt took place. What was the response? Well, the response was to appoint a commission that was supposed to come up with a set of recommendations in 6 weeks. And bear in mind, this was in reaction to public dissatisfaction with trends that were long visible in the sort of data that Danny showed us. These were inevitable surprises that occurred. Interministerial coordination is difficult, low levels of stakeholder and public engagement, not sufficient use of research, information, analysis, difficulty in moving from enunciating a strategy and then really carving into policies that actually are addressed to implement the strategy, and inadequate attention to actual measurement of what happened, what the outcomes are. What obstacles exist in Israel to developing this strategic perspective? Well, basically all of the usual ones that you will find in every democratic society. This is really tough stuff. It's really tough stuff to make this work. And by the way, among all the countries we looked at, there is none that I would say, they've got this problem worked. They're constantly evolving, constantly experimenting, and so on. In Israel, you've got a few other issues that come in. One is, the fact that Israel deals with a problem that nobody else really has to deal with, except possibly the government of the Ukraine and so on. And this always sucks the oxygen out of the room. Actually, it's one of the reasons to have institutions for strategic assessment and analysis, because otherwise, if this is something people have to work on their spare time when not dealing with security crises, it's never going to happen. Second is that I discovered early on, coming to Israel, that when people, I would talk and they would say, well, this is kind of academic or theoretical. I didn't realize that I was being insulted in about the worst terms you could possibly use inside of Israel. I quickly learned that was the case. And, there is a tendency to see this as, well, now, look, we've got real problems. We've got to get to work. I have been known to say that in Israel, there is never enough time to actually do kind of the analysis and the policy process, but there is all the time in the world to live with the consequences of not having done so. This is something that I got in trouble with the last time I said this in a public forum, because the next day I read in the newspaper that I was calling for the re-Bolshevization of Israel's economy and government. But the policy, those organs that are doing the slow thinking, the deliberative kind of policy, they're really relatively small in Israel. I can go into reasons why I believe that it's the case, but it's a reality that there is an overload. There is a lot that people need to take on their plate. And then there's this fundamental problem. I started out, and indeed Professor DeHaan started out, with talking about the need for a vision. Well, how do you create a vision? How do you create a vision in a country where you can have deathly arguments about changes in bus routes, and different communities are affected, and so on? It seems impossible. How do you develop a vision statement, a mission statement for the state of Israel? And I'll end by suggesting a couple of ways in which one can think about it, where perhaps this doesn't become as difficult or insoluble a problem as it appears. I very often find that, when working a strategic problem, or indeed any problem, it's very useful to begin from the end. And that's one way that you could think about what is a vision for a future Israel. Suppose you could send a time traveler, into the future to bring back information about Israel from a later date. And in fact, what he brings is a copy of the Economist newspaper, as they like to call it, from the year 2027. And the cover story is about Israel, about the new Israel, why it now works. You can ask the question, what does this story say? What is it that people in Israel would like this story to have said? What would need to change in order for that story to come true? What would need to happen in the short run, in the year 2014, the year 2015, to have this come true a dozen years later? What didn't happen that allows this story to be true? It occurs to me that there is another approach that one can take, and that is really kind of from the ground up. Economists talk about revealed preferences. Well, what is it that Israelis care about? What is it that their government addresses themselves to? And here you can bring in the concept of a balanced scorecard. By which I mean is, instead of having a single bottom line, you have a number of categories that you give equal importance to. What is the well-being of the individual in Israel? What determines that? And we're not just concerned about the individual of today, but that individual tomorrow, and his children and his children's children. So now there's a category of questions and issues about sustainable, growing, innovative economy and society. There is a whole issue of effective government, communal action. How does democracy work? To what extent is there equal access to opportunity? In Israel, even in a discussion about, domestic issues, you can't get far from the national security questions, the role that Tzahal plays in Israeli society, and so on and so forth. And then in Israel, there is this elephant in the room, that Israel is the civilizational homeland of the Jewish people, just the way that Germany is the civilizational homeland of the German people. What role does that play? What choices are made? Now, you don't necessarily have to look at all of these and give them equal weight. If you're looking at socioeconomic issues, some become more important than others. But it does give you a way of now setting out broad goals in each one of these categories, and then beginning to say, well, what are the dimensions that contribute to these goals? What contributes to the well-being of individuals? Income, wealth, housing, health status, personal security, and you can go on down the line. Now you have the opportunity of actually perhaps stating what would be desirable outcomes in each one of these categories. You can now begin to think about what are the indicators? How do we understand in Israel how we are proceeding towards these goals, these outlines? And once you do that, you now all of a sudden have a tool to do a number of things. First, obviously, as I suggested, there's the instrumental use. You can begin to measure progress, suggest course corrections, and so on. Secondly, and subtly, when you, again, go back to the issue of process, when you are doing this, you are creating a means for sharing ideas, for having discussions among people. How do you tie together different perspectives on issues? And then you also have the means for creating mobilization for action in a wider sphere. For those of you familiar with the conditions in Israel, you might despair looking at this prescription and comparing it to the reality that you know. But let me close by offering some words of hope. And I say this as an outsider who perhaps is able to see things somewhat differently. The first thing is, I don't think 15 or even 12 years ago there would be anybody in the government of Israel who would be interested in talking to me. The government of, the Israel of a couple of decades ago basically viewed itself as unique. You're going to come from Southern California and tell us what to do about transportation or energy or so on. It would have been the attitude. That's no longer the case. Especially in the last 6 years, I see evidence of an increasing hunger to understand what happens elsewhere, what lessons can be learned. How can Israel do the benchmarking that Danny has been doing so ably with his colleagues at the Taub Center? Secondly, is that I talk with a lot of people inside Israel's government, very intelligent, very dedicated, very purposeful people who are dissatisfied with business as usual, and they are very, very interested in looking for change. And finally, some actual practical steps have been taken. In October of 2012, the government actually decided to create new institutions within the government precisely to do strategic thinking. There is now a strategy unit that exists in the Prime Minister's office under the National Economic Council. There's a strategy forum of deputy mankalim, those associated with planning and so on and so forth, new processes. There are actual attempts to stimulate demand for strategic thinking, for the strategic perspective. And frankly, I know better, I do not know any better than you how well this will turn out. If you look at the odds are against the success. This, as I say, is a very difficult thing to do, but the important steps have been taken, and who knows, Israel may surprise itself. With that, I thank you very much for your attention.
Stephen will ask you to stay with us. We'll take a couple of questions from the audience. If there are any, please raise your hand.
Hi, my name is Emmanuel Shachaf. What would you say is the single biggest problem for Israel today? Out of the many you mentioned, you mentioned several and discussed several problems we had. What's the single biggest problem we have to deal with?
You got that? Maybe we'll take a few at once and give you a couple minutes to respond all together. Yes, please.
My name is Uri Aviram, and disagreeing with the importance of strategic planning, especially among this group of people, it would be impossible. It would be like denying the importance of motherhood, I would say. But my question is, given the fact that there are so many unexpected changes in the world and that we cannot predict them, what kind of processes and structures you suggest in order to make the proper adaptation between the planning and the unexpected changes?
My name is Paul, and I had a question about how governments could implement strategies when they may not be incented to do so. So, for instance, I'm American, and I'm very used to more of a paralyzed government. And I've talked to many Israelis, and they feel similar about that there is a strategy to a desirable outcome to produce, but there's not a government that's willing to take those steps. And I'm curious as to what your opinion might be as to how to encourage governments to implement withdrawal strategies.
All right.
What is Israel's biggest problem? I don't think that Israel's biggest problem is missiles in the hands of Hezbollah. I don't think Israel's biggest problem is what may or may not happen with the nuclear program in Iran. In general, I don't think Israel's biggest problem is to be found outside of Israel. I think that the biggest issue in Israel, I mean, there are several that you can point to, but it is, being able to create a polity, being able to create a unity where all of its citizens feel part of the economy, part of the society, and would wish to, continue to be part of it. I'm not speaking about Jewish versus Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel necessarily. That's an element of it, but if you look at the history of Jewish commonwealths over history, they fall because of internal dissension. Unlike the pilgrims who came ashore at Plymouth Rock in the United States and other instances, there is a problem of organizing societies that seems to be a recurring problem within Jewish communities, within the history of Jewish governments in this land. So, generally speaking, dealing with those issues that cause distance to arise, dealing with the things that create gulfs, are certainly the things that I would put at the top of my priority list. Second, there's a question about how do you deal with prediction forecasts in a world where everything is changing all the time? Well, that's the question that I've been dealing with for the last 20 years. I've developed methodologies, I've worked with governments, I've taught classes and so on. The questioner is right that, if we rely on forecasts, we are doomed. In fact, I took a slide out of this slide pack talking precisely about this in the interest of time. Bottom line, once you start thinking about forecasts and predictions, that raises a problem, because now you've got sort of an illusion of control. If you look at systems of magic that have existed throughout human history, there is something powerful about being able to name something by its true name, but by an individual by its true name. That gives you power over it. And in the same way, we fall into the trap when we make forecasts, predictions, particularly ones that we believe, of feeling we have now dealt with the problem of uncertainty, with the fear that arises. I have many, many writings on this subject. The bottom line is that you need to, in fact, go through systems of analysis, systems of thinking that don't make assumptions, that don't bury assumptions, but actually allow the assumptions to come out and be explicit, to have processes where these assumptions are tested, and generally to find courses of action where even if you cannot predict what the future will be, the things that you care about, the course of action is relatively protected from, different outcomes. So, in addition to developing a strategy, you also need to think in terms of what are the signposts that tell us that the assumptions upon which the strategy is based may be changing. You need to think about what are the hedging actions I can take, I can build into my strategy in case the world turns out to be different than I intended. And what are the shaping strategies that I can engage in? What are the ways in which I can actually affect the way the world plays out so that my assumptions come closer to being true? Believe me, that's a very short answer to a very, very complicated and excellent question. How do you convince government to do these things? Well, in a way, it's related to the first question. I'm convinced that people have policy conversations based upon simple models. And if you can create, a simple model that people can use to have a policy discussion, it actually affects policy outcomes. Let me give you an example. In 1929, there was the stock market crash. We went into the Depression. There were all kinds of remedies that were suggested for what should happen. And unfortunately, many of those remedies were put into place, really policies that we would now look at with horror, wouldn't dream of doing. But at the time, there was really kind of no simple model. There was nothing that allowed people to say, well, yeah, I guess that makes sense. I mean, we should pull in our belt because, income to the government is going down and so on and so forth. That created this downward spiral. Now, we went through the same thing in 2008, but a number of solutions that were suggested in the public sphere were they weren't all over the map. They tended to be a lot closer to a center. What had changed? Well, what had changed in the meantime was what is the most boring part of economics. We created a system of national accounting. We created concepts like unemployment. Up until the 20th century, there really wasn't anything like unemployment as a concept. You either worked or you starved, or on public relief. Concepts like national income, like current account, like GDP and so on and so forth. We now had a vocabulary. We now had a simple model, not only to have a wider discussion about policy, but to allow people to say to their government, well, why are you suggesting that course of action? What's it going to do to the unemployment rate? What's it going to do to the inflation rate? And similarly, I think that the strategic perspective, the analysis that you bring to it, can create how should I say it, kind of an acceptable, a sphere for government action where there can be a political process, but where you have clearly defined a space where going outside of that space really looks to be something that would compromise long-term goals and long-term interests. So you create an enhanced ability to have a conversation between those who govern and those who are governed. I like to say that, when I do work for a government as an analyst, someone who is doing a contract as a RAND analyst, I am writing a report for the people who sponsored the research, but I'm also doing a fairly subversive thing, which is I'm creating a paper trail. I'm creating something that allows others to speak with an authoritative expertise and ask the government, well, why are you doing this when there is a study that says that if you do that, it's going to have, bad outcomes and so on. I think this is, again, not a trivial problem, but it's really the case of kind of water dripping on the rock. It's something that is not going to be, an immediate change. It's going to be a gradual change. And a lot of it has to do with all those things that, your teachers taught you in civics class about democracy. It has to do with public engagement. It has to do with a willingness to participate. But it's definitely a two-way street. Both parts of the transaction, both the government and the governed, need to be participants. Again, with that, I will thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Popper, for the fascinating lecture and for the question and answer session. We will now take a break for lunch, which you're all invited to enjoy outside the hall. We will start again here at 12:45 sharp.